So today we celebrate the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, and just to make sure that we're all on the same page, that's not the story we just heard in the Gospel. That Gospel tells the story of Mary learning she's going to have a baby by the power of the Holy Spirit. The feast we celebrate today is about Mary being conceived. The Immaculate Conception tells us that Mary herself was conceived and born without original sin. And our first reading kind of sort of explains original sin, what it is, where it came from. It's that tendency all of us seem to have that makes us prone to do things we don't necessarily want to do, or maybe to want to do things we know we shouldn't. This story of Adam and Eve and God and a snake may be a myth, but there's truth there. Please don't think that the word myth means not true. In fact, an older meaning for that word means always and deeply true. So although the way that sin entered our world might not have involved two naked people, a tree, and a snake, the point is that the story, sin did enter the world. And I think most of us only need to look into our own hearts to recognize that. I suspect that whatever sin is, it's kind of what St. Paul described as to not do the good we want, but do the evil we do not want. We just all seem to have that in us. And I think it's nicely described as that dance between the serpent and the woman's heel. She strikes at its head, it strikes at her heels, an original sin, tap dance, time step. The result is that we humans just seem to have a tendency to be less than we can be. And we spend a good chunk of our lives not doing the good we want, but instead doing the evil we don't want. That sinful residue that affects all of us is real, but the church teaches that the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus delivered us from sin, both from that original sinful tendency and from personal sins we commit. In fact, the church teaches that the same life, death, and resurrection of Jesus that delivers us also delivered Mary. It's just that she somehow received that gift a little bit in advance. Kind of like getting to see the movie in the theater before it opens officially, or reading a copy of the book before it gets published. Our church teaches that Mary was redeemed from sin from the very start of her existence, but we've all been delivered too. That happened for you and me in a sacramental way when we got baptized. But because Mary received that special gift, some people might kind of think that this feast is somehow about Mary being different. After all, not just anyone would be qualified to be the mother of God. But since we've also been delivered from sin, I think you might say we're very much like Mary. What we heard about in today's gospel was Mary's yes, what the theologians call her fiat, her agreement to cooperate with the will of God. She, among all women ever, trusted God, said yes, and literally birthed God into the world. But all of us are called to do something very similar to that. Trusting in God and making God present in our world kind of, to me, seems like the job description of pretty much every Christian. And from that vantage point, I think we can see today's feast not as one that sets Mary apart, but rather one that connects us to her. We also have been delivered from sins. We also are called to help God be born into the world. Although the church teaches that Mary was given a special gift, that calling is universal. Now, what birthing God into the world looks like for you or for me may be different than what it looked like for Mary, but it seems to me we're all called to do that. And if you'll permit me, I quickly want to mention a couple of examples of different ways to birth God into the world. The first involves a relative, my Uncle Jim. I'm named for him. My grandmother had measles when she was pregnant with Jim, and he went through life with intellectual disabilities, hearing impairments, difficulty with speech, few problems involving the way he moved. Jim understood that he was different, but it didn't limit him. He sold newspapers on a street corner in South St. Louis, and every afternoon, he was a friendly face for hundreds of people who got to know him as they stopped their cars and rolled down their windows and bought a paper. And he also dropped newspapers into the mailboxes of neighbors who'd gotten too old to make the trek up to the corner to pick the paper up. He brought news, he brought a smile, and he usually concluded brief conversations with one of his catchphrases, telling people either to be careful, or when there was a problem of some kind, don't worry about it. And later, when his mother, my grandmother, got old and infirmed, in spite of Jim's limitations, he took care of her. He fed her. He cleaned up after her as her body began to fail. You won't read about him in history books or in the scriptures, but in his own unique way, he was birthing God into the world around him. A completely different example I also want to mention is a funeral that I attended last week. A young man had died after a long, painful battle with cancer, and the funeral, several of us were there. It was very beautiful, but it was also very sad. And I mention it because as I sat in the church, I could see the face of this young man's mother. And as I looked at her face, I was reminded of Mary. There was pain, but there was peace. Both of these women had said yes to motherhood. Both had done their best to raise young men to be good people. Both had lost those young men when they were in their early 30s. Both lived through the pain of having to watch their sons suffer, knowing there really was nothing they could do. And ultimately, both had to let go and watch their sons die. But through all of that, they both did what they'd been called to do to make God present in the world. We're called to birth God into our world in ways that are unique to us. This woman's son, by the way, who had died, was quoted on the card that they gave those who attended the Mass. And his quote said, "Cancer has taught me to love, or to just want to love everyone, and to really and truly hope for the best for all people." End quote. And again, God is birthed into the world. All of creation reflects the Creator, from a glorious sunrise to a majestic mountain to the way your dog acts when you come home after a long day. And as beings created in the image and likeness of the Creator, we make God present in the world, literally birthing God into the world. But we all do that in different ways because all of us are different. And we're all called to say yes, just like Mary did. And we do still sin, and we do still have sinful inclinations, and we do still struggle with temptation, and sinfulness strikes at our heels, and we try to stomp on its head. But God's grace and forgiveness, the very same grace and forgiveness God gave to Mary from the start of her existence, can make us free to say yes too. And I think our yeses can change the world. So let me leave you today with a poem. It's about saying yes when we're asked to birth God into the world. It was written by Robert Morneau, who's a poet and a former auxiliary bishop of Green Bay, Wisconsin. Were others asked, a lassie from an isle in a distant sea, a maiden in North Africa, or a slave girl from the Congo? How many times were angels sent and returned, unheard, unheeded? Was Mary 10th on salvation's list, or the 100th? And you, my soul, was fiat spoken when the angel came? Well,